Greetings, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining us for yet another episode of The Development Context of Sovereign Credit Ratings, a podcast by UNDP Africa and Africatalyst. My name is Maggie Motesi, and I'll be your host today. Now, credit ratings play a critical role in shaping the development agenda of most African countries, and these we've seen influence everything from borrowing costs to investor confidence across the countries. But beyond the technicalities of the rating agencies and methodologies also lies an equally critical question that probably is in regards to regulation and governance and how we ensure a fairness and accountability in how ratings are assigned. In many ways, getting these ratings right is about much more than just numbers. It's about expanding a country's fiscal space and the financial room to maneuver that enables essential investments in development infrastructure and social progress. In this episode, our aim is to provide you with a deeper understanding of the governance challenges facing, rating agencies, but also to inspire thoughtful dialogue on potential solutions for a more robust and transparent ratings environment. And here we mean one that can foster greater confidence and investment for African countries. Now in the studio, I'm joined by Jean-Marc Kilolo, an economist with the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Jean-Marc, it's really to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That's a real pleasure for me.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you. I also, want our listeners to know that we've actually had conversations about some of these topics through the UNDP Africatalyst initiative workshops that we've had in Addis with you and the ECA. So it's been a pleasure hearing some of these developments and conversations. So I just wanted to bring you in to help us probably set the stage of this conversation. When we talk about governance in the context of credit ratings, what specific aspects do you believe are most crucial to ensuring fairness and accountability? And obviously, these are some conversations we've had during the workshops for the initiative.
Thank you very much, Maggie. So when we talk about governance, we believe that it's very important to regulate the activities of credit rating agencies in Africa. First and foremost, it's essential to enhance transparency when it comes to methodologies and assumptions. So there is a lot of that has been done to strengthen, build capacity to African experts to understand the rating exercise. So, because credit rating has a lot of implication. Now, when it comes to methodologies, to many, the rating exercise come up as a Pandora box. You don't really know how different elements, indicators are factored in. Let's look at the big three global agencies, Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's. So they make their methodologies available. They inform about what are the factors that they take into account, but we don't know as yet how do they weigh those factors. They take into account your economy fundamentals, your GDP, your competitiveness, your fiscal strength, your structural some structural features such as the government effectiveness, monetary policy, and also some external or risk factor like geopolitical risk, etc. But what is the weight given to each and every one of those elements? So this is not well known. It's very important that African countries and countries in general are well informed on how this exercise is conducted so that they can replicate or even forecast their own credit rating, because that has a lot of implication when it comes to the cost of borrowing and many other aspects that we'll be alluding during this conversation.
Yeah, and obviously that's one of the things the UNDP Africatalyst initiative is addressing in terms of helping countries understand the methodologies. But when it comes to ensuring that, like you've mentioned, these really reflect the true development potential of a country, how do we move beyond just economic indicators like GDP and look at factors like social progress, infrastructure, and overall fiscal health? And Jean-Marc, I would imagine in the context of Africa, how you probably look at true development is probably different from some of other countries. Just enlighten me on this and maybe just give us a deeper understanding.
So you alluded to GDP. GDP is, I'll say, the one of the most important factors that capture the soundness of an economy.
Yeah.
Beyond that, you also mentioned your question, social factors. To the best of our knowledge, those factors are not factored in. We know that Africa has a young population that has the potential to really foster economic development, industrialization, and growth. But these kind of factors are not taken into account. Also, importantly, I want to shed light on natural capital. Africa is home to a wide variety of natural resources. Africa is home to almost two-thirds of cobalt, which is a critical or a strategic mineral in the current context of fighting climate change. And this is wealth per se. When we look at GDP, for instance, we look at production. But production is underpinned by endowments. And Africa is very, very rich. We know that we have a vibrant extractive sector. But so far, this is not factoring when we look at Africa's potential. And some economists and researchers are advocating for accounting for that wealth, because this is what underpins wealth. And it's very important to develop some strategies to factor it in, not only in the credit rating exercise, but also when we look at Africa. Africa offers opportunities. So that's why global mining companies are doing business in the continent. But despite that fact, Africa is looked down at when we consider credit rating. Africa is depicted as a risky business place environment, whereas we see a lot of foreign companies operating in African soil despite those assessments.
Yeah, so the reality doesn't reflect the ratings, in other words. So we are literally saying, look at us in a different context in terms of development. What you see doesn't really reflect our progress. I just want to put it in layman's language. Is that what you're trying to point out?
That's right. Africa has made a lot of progress. When you look at ECA economic reports, as well as African Development Bank reports, just to name those too few institutions, we see that Africa has performed quite well in terms of growth, but that has not been reflected in credit rating assessments. So that's why the AUC, with many African bodies like ECA, are pushing for the establishment of an African credit rating agency to really factor in idiosyncrasies, factors that are proper to Africa, to have a better and sound assessment of the real economic potential of the continent.
Yeah, and with thanks for bringing that up, because we've seen the push. It was nice also to see presidents acknowledge the UNDP Africa List Initiative in terms of really supporting countries navigate the rating processes. But I want to touch a bit more on the creation of the Africa Credit Ratings Agency, the independent one, especially in terms of credibility, accuracy, and international perception. One would think that this could be a challenge, much as it could be an opportunity for African countries. To what extent do you think actually investors, or it could be perceived to be a credible source of? Just talk to us about some of the challenges that you foresee.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Of course, there are challenges as well as opportunities.
Yeah.
The first one will be about credibility, to build trust with global investors as well as African investors. Because even African investors, when they hear that Africa is a risky place, many of them will be inclined to invest elsewhere. Say, maybe Africa is not a safe place. Let me invest in Europe. Maybe let me invest in America. and in anywhere else but Africa. So that's very important. Credibility. Of course, when you compare to the major international credit rating agencies that has been operating for centuries,
Yeah, that's what I got. Yeah.
yes, building credibility is really, really a challenge. But thanks to the work of APRM, UNDP Africa, ECA, Africa Catalyst, those institutions, through their publications and advocacy, has pointed out to some of the shortcomings and inconsistencies of sovereign credit ratings in Africa, which really advocate for an alternative. So I think most African leaders, be it president or prominent institutions, welcome this, and the challenge will be indeed to build that credibility. So the other challenge is data access. It's very important to this end to strengthen statistical capacity of African countries to provide accurate data that are consistent to really portray each African country's potential. Third, attached to credibility is recognition. So it need to be recognized on international market as well as African market. But we believe that with the support of African institutions that I mentioned earlier, we can add to those African MDBs like Afreximbank, AFC, Badia. I think they can play a role in the risking if those institutions accept, recognize the credibility of the African credit rating agency, then eventually others will follow. And they are probably the one to lead the race in that particular aspect, including African sovereign. The other challenge will be also political interference. So this body, to gain recognition and credibility, should be maintained as an independent body. So that's very, very important and should operate with the same standards as the major international credit rating agencies. Now, let me speak to the opportunities. Of course, we expect from the African Credit Rating Agency fairer ratings that are context sensitive, that really capture Africa idiosyncrasies and particularities. And of course, with these fair ratings, we expect that will reduce risk perception so that African nations will be able to benefit from lower borrowing costs. I think those are the two major opportunities that I can foresee.
Yeah. From what I see, to be honest, I feel like the challenges are a little bit many. But obviously, where, like you mentioned earlier, this is Africa's place of opportunities. So we look on the brighter side. But when you were talking especially about the access to data, even now with the global rating agencies, the big three, one of the key things they keep saying is that, this is all we get from the countries. And you've been part of these workshops we've held before. We had an ex-analyst on the show earlier on, and he mentioned, look, countries are not able to provide enough data to us to really support the processes. Now, with starting an own independent agency, Jean-Marc, with the data challenges we have, not just even on the agencies, but I'm sure even in other aspects of operations, this seems like a really long shot, no?
Yes, of course. I think this point on data is paramount. The main challenge, according to me, has to do with the institutionalization of the credit function. What I want to say with this wording is that it's very important, with the support of UNDP Africa, ECA, APRM, to really institutionalize the credit rating function, meaning that African countries has to take this exercise very seriously. There should be dedicated personnel in the Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, and many other line ministries, including the Statistical Bureau, that are devoted to build data and provide those data to credit rating agencies. And also to be not to be attentist, but whenever there is a new development, to be eager to share that to those existing credit rating agency and to the African credit rating agency to come. So there has to be proactive. So it's only when that credit rating function will be part of institutions that we will expect better credit ratings from existing rating agencies as well as the AFCRA. So that's very important, and that's something that we have been pushing for when building capacity and assisting African sovereigns.
Yeah, I think it's a very critical point to note. We work with different aspects of our economies. Access to data, to information is very critical. And I think it really needs to be taken in a serious way in terms of updating the data and making sure that it's at par or it's at speed with the country's developmental reforms. So ECA has emphasized the need for regulatory mechanisms to supervise the credit rating agencies, the big three. In your perspective or where you see it, what specific mechanisms do you believe should be implemented beyond what you've discussed at the beginning?
Well, let me maybe speak to two important regulatory mechanisms. First, there is a need at the national as at the African level to have an independent oversight body modeled after the ESMA, which is the European authority. Why that? Look at Europe. I think looking at what is going on in Europe will be very insightful. In Europe, for instance, rating agencies are asked to provide a calendar of the actions. So they cannot just wake up and downgrade the country because there has been an adverse development, or upgrade the country because something has happened that they think is very important. So there is a calendar, and they also have to provide the intel when financial markets are closed. This is a way to avoid disruptive phenomena, right? Because financial markets react very quickly. So that's very important to make sure that credit rating activities are controlled, are managed by an authority, being national or supranational. By the ideal will be to come up with an African model that will be adopted across Africa for consistency. To make sure that one regulation, let's say in Nigeria, is similar to, let's say, Zambia, to make sure there is consistency in terms of actions and activity performed by credit rating agency. The other one, probably the most challenging one, is about the appeal mechanism. How do African countries challenge unfair ratings? Why is that? Because ratings have detrimental, especially I'm alluding here to poor ratings. You know that most of the African countries are rated as non-investment grade. People will say junk countries. So when an investor will look at the credit ratings, okay, those countries are not a nice, I'll say, environment to invest in. So if I want to invest in, I have to ask for a premium. The direct consequence of this is that African sovereigns generally pay more to borrow from international markets. So now, if there is a mistake made by a credit rating agency, how do we make sure that they correct that? How do we make sure that they are penalized for making the wrong assessment? And I think that this will create also an incentive that they will think twice before downgrading a country. So they have to be very careful to look at the fundamentals, and ideally, as the credit function is institutionalized in African countries, so they interact with the national African national counterparts to make sure that their assessment is the right one before taking an action. I think those are, to me, very important regulatory aspects when supervising credit rating agencies.
And thanks, Jean-Marc. You've given us an understanding in terms of governance. And for me, what is a key takeaway is really increasing data availability and understanding the methodologies and processes. I think we tend to look at this from, we can just give this, but these are key things that we should also be able to focus on and dedicate specific teams to be able to change the narrative about our own countries. And, this obviously will at least influence or shape some of the ratings that are being made on African countries. Jean-Marc, thank you so much for making time today. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for speaking to us. And to all the viewers, thank you so much for tuning in and for being part of the development context of sovereign credit ratings, a podcast by UNDP Africa and Africatalyst. We'll be back here next month with another episode, but on another topic, but still focusing on credit ratings and African countries. Thank you. My name is Maggie Mutesi, and bye for now.